Hello, my name is Jerry Sternberg. I'm 93 years old, and to my own knowledge, I'm the oldest Jewish person in the community who is a native, still living here. Today, we're going to tell you a story that was motivated by another documentary done by Sharon Farr, our great local Jewish historian, about the Jewish people who came to Asheville and were retail merchants. In this documentary, we're going to talk about the many Jewish people who came here and worked in the manufacturing, recycling, and industrial industry in our city. Over the centuries, the Jewish people have been moved from place to place to place, but we always seem to be able to survive because in our culture, the number one thing is education. We also have a serious work ethic. We also are creative. And these kind of traits have allowed us not only to survive being expelled from country after country, but have allowed us to be extremely successful. And especially in small towns like Asheville, and this is the town I know best, so you're going to hear about Asheville. We're not particularly popular, and they weren't trusted because they were different. So they weren't invited to work in the real estate business or the insurance business or in the banking business. So they found themselves left with businesses such as recycling businesses, such as scrap iron, scrap metal, rags, waste paper, and other recycled items. And by the late 1890s, Asheville had gotten a railroad. It also had this beautiful river that runs through here, and the railroad followed the river because that was the easiest way to build the road. And most of the businesses that the Asheville Jewish Industrialists were located here on the river and on the Shenandoah River. Let's start our story on Depot Street, where my father and my grandfather operated recycling facilities to handle scrap metal and hides, and also it's the location of the old Glen Rock Hotel and the iconic Southern Railway Depot. Behind where I'm standing was a beautiful structure of the Asheville passenger terminal for the Southern Railway. The railway made a huge difference in the economy of Asheville, and because tourists could get here conveniently by rail, because we didn't have the roads, and we particularly got tourists from Florida, where it was so hot, would come here in the summertime, and some eventually settled here. But the big excitement when I was a kid was when everybody talked about number 9 from New York City is coming in. They'd be hollering that, and that train, that passenger train, would come in and bring all these Yankees down here dressed up in their finery. When they rode the railroad, a lot of people, the women had big hats and they were dressed, the men in suits and ties, and when I knew number 9 was coming, I'd skip down here and run out here and try to help them carry their cases, and maybe they'd give me a quarter or a dime or whatever. Anything I could do to hustle a dime, that was how I was brought up. That was the life blood of all of those businesses, because we didn't have the big tractors and trailers, we didn't have the roads, and so trucking was a really difficult thing. The railroad was the heart and soul of the industrial transportation in those days. The Glen Rock Hotel was a commercial hotel because it was right across the street from the passenger station, and a lot of railroad men would come here and stay at the Glen Rock when they were during their downtime. And over there at the barber shop, they even had showers and shaves for the crews. When I was a boy, they used to send me on errands all up and down this street. That was what I did. I was a gopher. And I would bring bills of lading down here to the railroad office, and I was very proud of myself when I had those bill of ladings, how important I was. They made it very clear you couldn't lose it or tear it, and I felt very important. And then one day I was walking here in front of the Glen Rock, which, as I say, had deteriorated due to the railroad shutting down the passenger service. And I heard 2 men talking, and one of them pointed inside the Glen Rock and said, "That's a cat house in there." And I got to thinking about that. And every time I walked by the Glen Rock for 2 or 3 years, I kept looking inside to see if I saw any cats. By 1900, we had many mills that started up in this area because we now had the railroad. The railroad brought coal in for the steam, to generate steam in huge quantities. We had the river water to furnish the steam. And so all these mills were built along the river and all over the South particularly. Before the Industrial Revolution, the biggest use for leather was shoes, boots, saddles, and leather jackets. When the Industrial Revolution came, the most important thing and use for leather became leather belting. Leather belting was used they had a big flywheel on the end of the steam generator. That would turn, and the leather belting would transmit the power to a line shaft that ran through the mill. And they had many pulleys on them. And so the belt would turn that line shaft with the power from the steam, and the machines were run from the power of those pulleys. The machines on the ground were operatable. So leather became an extremely important commodity, and therefore hides became a very big business. And my grandfather bought a hide business here in Asheville. My grandfather, Siegfried Sternberg, came into this country in 1890 in the port of Houston. His family were cattle traders in Germany. He found out about a hide business in Asheville, in the cowhide business, and he came here and opened up a business. In this building hides were processed. They would take the skins, they would trim them, and then they had to cure them with a salt brine combination. They would lay the hide out, they would spray salt all over it, then they would pour brine on top of it and stack them up like pancakes. And for at least 30 days, those hides had to be cured that way to prevent them from rotting so they could be usable when they shipped them to the tannery to make leather out of. It was very hard work and not too pleasant. Years, my father came here, went away to college and went away to work somewhere else and came back and opened his business. He did the same kind of business. He had hides were his main business. Scrap metal also was a big part of his business. And in 1937 or 38, he moved into this building here. My grandfather by then had built a new building out on over on Riverside Drive. During the war, there wasn't much money to be made in scrap metals because of the ceiling prices. So my dad went into a number of other businesses, mostly using a sewing room, which was upstairs in one of these buildings right here. We had women, we started out using leather scrap and making Snoopy helmets like they use like aviator helmets for kids. Then when the war broke out, there was leather was in short supply, but we had Dayton Rubber Company out here who made life rafts, and they had cuttings left over from the life rafts, and they made the Snoopy helmets out of life rafts and also made book bags. Down at the military bases, they would buy the discarded military clothes when they shipped guys that were, say, in cold weather to warm weather. They had to give them different uniforms. We would buy all those uniforms. They were torn and sewn, buttons off, and we would repair those uniforms and sell them, because during the war it was hard to find a good wool shirt or a good wool pair of pants. And so we were in that business also. Okay, in 1961, I left my father's business and went into the surplus and salvage business and the industrial scrap metal business. I also went into the Dempster dumpster business, and we were the first people to offer containerized service in Asheville and western North Carolina. We're making this shot from here at the Smith Bridge, which is at the corner of Riverside and West Haywood Street. Behind me, you can see the smokestack left over from the old cotton mill. We operated in this area for several years. One of the most fortunate things that happened to me during those years was the arrival of a young man who came from Brooklyn, New York, came to Asheville because his wife's uncle Charles Parmet was director of the Jewish Community Center. He worked for a couple of the textile recycling firms, and he came to me looking for a job, or asked me for a job. His name was Jack Dolaboff, and he was a bright, energetic young guy, and eventually he became my partner, and we were extremely successful. We were in many different things. We used to say we bought everything from railroad wrecks to house dresses. During the 1990s, a new organization came to town with the idea of converting the river district into a tourist park and displacing all of us very hard-working small business people who had all kind of different businesses up and down the river, scrap yards, manufacturing, mill works, and they weren't pretty, but they provided all of us with a living, and many employees made their living out of it. And these people wanted to condemn our properties. and shut us down. I was always an active political person, and I became president of the River Rats. And we took on this group of people. During this discussion, a professor at the University of North Carolina decided that he thought the river district looked like Bangladesh. So I decided that maybe we should call ourselves Bangladesh, and I put a big banner up in front of my building there, my A-frame building, that said, Bangladesh City Hall. Behind me is a remnant of what was a very large building called the Hans Reese Tannery Company, who tanned hides and turned them into leather. My daddy's company that bought and cured hides would sell Hans Reese the cured hides. Hans Reese would tan them. Interestingly, after Hans Reese moved out, this property was bought by Philip Ness, who's part of the Schlossman family. And I think he operated a textile waste business here, then sold it to his nephews, Benson and Freddie Schlossman. After that, they sold it to Elaine Green and her sister, who started out as a candle shop and now have turned it into a very successful artist studio. Frank Silverman came here in 1927 and operated a junk business, an auto parts business over here on this lot. Eventually, he got into piping and conduit, and his son Jerry ran the business very successfully. They were early pioneers in the community to get the Jewish Community Center established. We're standing on land that belongs to the Norfolk and Southern Railway. Early in the 50s, the Schullemson brothers came here, Bill, Maury, and Ben, and there was a huge junkyard here, and they operated for many years. And textile waste in the early days consisted of old woolen garments and woolen blankets and cotton sheets and cotton shirts, all from natural fibers. In later years, just before the war, they started inventing synthetic cloths, and that exponentially expanded the recycling business for those people who were in the so-called rag business in the early days. In 1935, Sam Schlossman moved to Asheville and joined his brother-in-laws, Philip and Irving Ness, in the sanitary waste business, and they sorted and sold and recycled textile rags such as shirts and sheets and wiping cloths. They were all, in those days, were made out of natural fiber. In 1967, Benson Schlossman joined the firm, opened up they went into the synthetic fiber business, and his brother came along and went into non-wovens and other types of textile waste. Later on, Freddie's son who was in the business named Jeff Schlossman. Jeff eventually decided to leave his father, and with the help of his grandfather, Hyman Dave, who was retired, he opened up and started a small textile waste business, eventually growing and growing and growing till his business encompassed a 500,000 square foot warehouse, and he employed 230 employees when he sold out the business. Isaac Gradman and his family met Philip Ness by accident on a trip from their home down in Louisville. And Philip Ness offered Isaac a job working in his scrap business in Asheville. Isaac moved his family down here, and later on he went into the hosiery waste recycling business. At one time was one of the largest hosiery waste recyclers in the United States. He operated in this building here for several years, and then his son Barney took over the business after Isaac's passing. Isaac was also one of the outstanding leaders in the community and was highly respected for his work with the Jewish Community Center and with the youth of the community. Somewhere in the very early 30s, my grandfather, Siegfried Sternberg, moved out of the building that we showed you on Depot Street and built this building here on Riverside Drive right next to the river, and operated a hide business in that building, plus other things such as salvage and scrap. Later on, my grandfather sold that business out to Mortimer Kahn. He and his sons went into the textile business and operated manufacturing some sort of cloth or textile, and the business was known as Broad River Processing Company. During World War II, Mort Kahn went to Washington and what was known as a $1-a-year man. He worked for the government as an executive, doing some kind of special work for the government for $1 a year as his contribution to the war effort. His family also, when the Jewish Community Center built the center, his family gave money to build the addition that was the auditorium and activity room, which was a great help for the Jewish Community Center. Rudolph Gumpert came to this country, I think, by the way of South America, escaping the Shoah, the Holocaust, and eventually wound up in Asheville. My dad gave him a job in the scrap business just down the street. We're next door to that building now. And eventually he opened up his own scrap business in this building, and eventually we got out of the scrap business and went into the business of handling textile waste, and he was extremely successful. He was married to Helen Gumpert, who was a Lichtenfels, Helen Lichtenfels Gumpert, and she was quite the community activist. Rudolph eventually grew his business and moved out on Sweeten Creek Road next to where my father's building was out there. The Jews went into a variety of manufacturing businesses. The needle trades were inherited from Europe and from the North, and they brought in people who made everything from ladies' house dresses to hosiery to parachutes and all sorts of textiles that required a lot of labor and they were very successful in these projects. Okay, with the advent of the arrival of the railroad and the proximity to the French Broad River, the W.E. Graham Company came here and built a huge cotton mill behind me. And right directly behind me you can see the smokestack that was necessary to operate their steam plant, which drove all the equipment. Eventually, this building and this business was bought out by the Cone brothers from Greensboro, North Carolina, and was known as Cone Mills. It was an important economic factor in this part of the country because we had very little manufacturing. We had farming, which didn't pay very well. We were in depressed times through the late 20s into the 40s. So Cone Mills and this property here was extremely important for the Asheville economy in western North Carolina. During World War II, they produced primarily denim for the military. And if you look up here, you can see a corner of a store. That was called the Olive Store. And that was what's known as the company store. The employees could go there and get their groceries, and they could buy their clothing and stuff on credit. And that was what's known in the South as the company store. Somewhere in the late 90s, the Asheville Cotton Mill, and next door, which was a feed mill, burned down one night and destroyed this building, leaving only a few sections left. The feed mill was entirely destroyed, and it's always been my opinion that in the cotton mill process there was a lot of lint that stuck around on the roofs and stuff, which was highly volatile. And the feed mill had the same kind of thing from where they ground up feed. And some spark, once it set off, created a huge fire. And after that, Riverlinks, who was doing river redevelopment, bought the cotton mill and has turned it into an artist colony. We are still on Depot Street. Is that my father's business that I showed you down the street? He hired a man named Joseph Dave out of Cincinnati. In a few years, my grandfather encouraged him to go into his own steel fabricating company. And this location right here, where you see those apartments, was originally one of the largest steel fabricating companies in the Southeast. Joe Dave was an incredible man. Dave Steel was very important to this community. Most of the buildings and bridges around here had Dave Steel products in their construction. And during World War II, they were very important to the war effort. They fabricated military boats called M-boats, which were cargo boats that came in with troops and equipment in them, and the front part of the boat landed on the beach, and the troops and the equipment could be moved off. The story of Joe and Jeanette Vanderwart are similar to so many stories of those fortunate Jews who were able to escape the Nazis and get out of Germany in the early 30s Joe made his way to New York City. Eventually, he got a job at a lumber company in Franklin, North Carolina, where he learned the lumber business. He moved to Asheville and went to work with Blaylock Lumber Company, which was located on this site. Eventually, Joe bought out the Blaylock Lumber Company and was very successful in the lumber business, employing some 200 employees at one time. I'm currently in front of the Carpin Steel Manufacturing Company. This company was started by Morris Carpin, who was married to an Asheville lady, Leah Robinson, and she was a very strong community activist, very active in both the Jewish and the regular community. Morris decided to open this business and built quality doors and windows. I think it's still run by some member of the family, and they've been great corporate citizens in this community, and they've done a lot for the people here in the Weaverville area. Ernie and Larry Mills grew up on Wall Street and decided to go into the manufacturing of novelties up in New York City, and eventually they started making parachutes. When the Korean War came along, they had to expand their business and decided to move to Asheville, where they built this large plant that's behind me here. Now there are approximately 150 employees working in this building. They're one of the premier manufacturers of parachutes worldwide, serving both the military and the civilians. They're both very generous men who served our community philanthropically and gave great support. And Mills is a very fine company that's recognized nationally. Harry and Lillian Lerner were both refugees from a terrible experience going through the Holocaust. Both managed to escape, and eventually they ended up in America, and they built Connie Fashions, a manufacturer of women's clothing. And here's the building behind me that was their final building. They were both ardent supporters of the Jewish community, and they were very successful, opening one or two more retail stores to sell their Connie Fashions. Their daughter, Connie, for whom the company is named after, was Miss North Carolina. Julius Bloom came to the United States from Europe in the late 40s, a victim of the Holocaust, and found his way to South Carolina. He eventually began working in the textile business and came to Asheville and opened a small knitting mill with 3 machines out in West Asheville. His business flourished, and he moved to Valley Street. Unfortunately, racism invaded his life again, and they burned out his knitting mill there. But he did not give up. He came out here to West Asheville and built this Blue Ridge knitting mill, which is behind me. they were very successful in making non-wovens, which was the new style of textiles at that time. Julius was very interested in Jewish education and made substantial contributions to our local university. One of the most successful manufacturing companies operated by Jewish merchants in this community was the Vanderbilt Shirt Company here on Lexington Avenue and behind me. Vanderbilt Shirt came here. Herbert Wadopin, Milton Lurie, Herman Silver built the Vanderbilt Shirt Company. They made Western shirts for Levi Strauss. They made several other women's clothes, but they were very forward-looking. Eventually, they grew out of this building, and they went out in West Asheville and built a much larger building. They were concerned about their employees, and when the employees needed medical help, they brought in medical people to not only help them with medicine, but to do preventive medicine. They also were one of the first manufacturing companies to operate a daycare center for the children of the employees. And they were quite the important citizens in this community for all they did, both economically and civically. Murray Bard was a textile specialist who came from Massachusetts, entered the textile business in New York, then went to South Carolina and eventually found his way to Asheville in 1945, and he opened a hosiery mill factory here in Asheville. He was innovative in that they began to make pantyhose, seamless hose, and other hosiery products that were new to the market. And they moved out to this building here in West Asheville, and they went into the ladies' dress business, and they made a very special kind of dress made out of paper. And it was the fad for a while. And people were very excited about the designs and what you could do with paper dresses. This gave forth to the production of paper hospital gowns that no longer required washing, they were disposable. And they made a great success in this building. But when Bob Baer joined, who was married to Audie, Maury's daughter, they moved out on Sardis Road into a bigger factory and made paper dresses, which were a fad at that time, but the fad led to a much more substantial use of making hospital gowns out of paper, so laundries weren't necessary, and it was so successful. Maybe the most important thing that comes out of this documentary is the contribution that the Jewish members of the community made to the employment of thousands of unskilled, uneducated people to work in these businesses and in the cotton mill. These people had all been farmers up until the time that the railroad came here, and they weren't making much of a living. At least now they had something they could get an hourly wage, and these jobs were very important. As time went on, they became more skilled, and particularly in the garment industry in our area, they hired people and trained to be cutters and seamsters and do all sorts of technical work. there are many amazing and sometimes tragic stories about those who came to Asheville and went into these various industrial businesses. Many of them came from the jaws of the Holocaust and made successes here at our town. Maybe the most iconic story is that of a man by the name of Marcus Reich, who we wish to dedicate this film to. Marcus lived in Poland, and when the Nazis took over, they captured him as a young boy, and he spent years in concentration camps. Twice he escaped death just by being a little more clever than the Nazis were. He was taken in and hidden by a lady in his neighborhood, or in the neighborhood of the concentration camp. Later on, he came to this country in 1947, and my daddy sponsored him, and he went to work in my daddy's scrap metal yard. Marcus was always a good-natured man. He couldn't speak English. He learned English. He was bright. He was very energetic, and eventually rose in my daddy's business to foreman. Then he learned how to be a machinist, and he opened a machine shop out in South Asheville, and eventually moved to Tennessee and expanded the machine shop. He was an outstanding citizen. He was an outstanding witness of the Holocaust atrocities, and despite all of the things that he had to go through, Marcus ended up financially and socially a very successful man and highly respected in the community. His local community on Montford Avenue even put a plaque in front of his house. I want to thank Sharon Farr for the wonderful book she has done. She's our local Jewish historian, and she also did a film about the downtown merchants. This motivated me to do this film. Most important, I want to thank Marty Gillen, who is a lifelong video producer and film artist who encouraged me to do this film and kept me on track and motivated me to tell this story.